Stanley Nelson, welcome to the Daily Social Distancing Show.
Thank you for having me.
As one of America's most prolific documentary filmmakers, you've received multiple awards, everything from Emmys to awards from President Barack Obama himself. You've always been adept at telling the story of the African American experience, and it feels like all stories would be incomplete without the story of the crack epidemic and the lies that surrounded that time during American history. As a filmmaker who's told every kind of story, why did you feel like this was a story that you needed to tell and everybody needed to see?
Well, I thought that the crack era was something that we really hadn't looked back on and hadn't, looked back on through the lens of time and through the distance of time. There was a lot of overblown reporting at the time, a lot of hyperbole, a lot of misconceptions, and I thought it was time that we looked at it in a new light.
Now, just one of the many things that makes this documentary special is that you are a native of Harlem. You lived in Harlem during the height of the crack epidemic, and you lived in Harlem during the height of the war on drugs.
Yeah, I mean, the crack era was crazy, for anybody that doesn't remember it. It was nuts, from the middle 80s to about the middle 90s. It was crazy. There were crack dealers everywhere. I remember coming home from a party at 3 o'clock at night and driving past the block in Harlem, and it looked like broad daylight. I mean, literally, there was 100 people on this one block. So it was everywhere. People were driving around in cars saying, crack, got that crack, everywhere. You didn't have to be Sherlock Holmes to find it, for law enforcement to see that it was going on and that it was everywhere. People had locks on their cars. People, had to protect their car radios. I remember people also had steering wheels that you could remove. Like you could remove your steering wheel and take it with you. So that make your car almost impossible to steal. So it was just crazy.
You talk to some of the most interesting people in this documentary. You interview subjects that range from the journalists who were covering it, the police who were involved on both sides of it, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But you also talk to the drug dealers themselves. You talk to the people who were pushing this on the streets. First question, how did you convince them to do this? And secondly, why did you think it was important to have them be part of the telling of the story?
I thought that the lies that were told about crack, in part were the lies that were told about the dealers, the lies that were told about the users. We interviewed one dealer, Samson Styles, who was very helpful in finding people to interview and actually became a consulting producer. But he was working at McDonald's. He was working at McDonald's for minimum wage. He had a high school sweetheart who was pregnant with a baby on the way, and somebody offered him crack to sell, and all of a sudden, as he says, in 20 minutes he was sold out and had hundreds of dollars in his pocket. And so, he started selling crack. So I think that it was important to cast the dealers in a new light. This wasn't a guy who woke up one day and said, I want to devastate my community. I want to be some evil guy. This was a kid. He was a high school kid who was working at McDonald's.
This documentary opens people's eyes not just to how the police were dealing with the crack epidemic, but how many of the police were involved in the distribution of drugs, the selling of drugs, the maintaining of the drug networks. Talk me through that. I mean, that's a scary narrative to go down. How do you make sure that you're getting correct information? How do you make sure that you're talking to the people who don't just have a grudge against the police and in fact are giving you information that is pertinent to the story you're telling?
Yeah, well, one is that the film has no narrator. So the people that we hear talking are the people who lived it. We hear cops from clips back then talk about busting drug dealers and taking their drugs. That police, as you arrest somebody on the corner, basically you can take their drugs and their money and let them go, or you can take them to jail. The police themselves give that story. One of the crack dealers tells a great story how the police, gave him back all his crack when they busted him and said, hey, tell your boss that we did you a favor. And he goes to his boss and his boss says, yeah, well, we're paying him off. That's why. So, it's from people's own words. I think one of the things that's really best said in the film is that, there was so much money and it was so crazy, in the crack era that the whole community was corrupted. Everybody was somehow corrupted, by this thing.
one of the, I would say one of the most powerful indictments in this documentary for me is looking at the media. Looking at how the media covered this epidemic, looking at how the media framed what was happening, looking at how the media vilified black people as a community. They didn't seem to do any journalism, even though it was the news. They just seemed to parrot the propaganda that was coming out from the United States government at the time. When you look back on that media, and we see this in the documentary, what do you think they were responsible for, or how much of the war on drugs that went wrong do you think the media was responsible for?
The media was definitely part of it. They would latch on to, crack babies and have headlines about 100,000 crack babies are going to, invade the schools in New York City, but also all over the country and change the whole education system. The crack mamas, crack hoes, that was a thing that we heard over and over again. And there was never an analysis of what was going on. We talked to a woman, a crack user in the film, and she talks about being arrested 5 times for possession, not for dealing, not for committing any crime, right, but for having crack in her pocket. And never once is she offered treatment.
What's really painful as well in this documentary is you watch the story of how black women bore the brunt oftentimes of this narrative. As you said, the crack mamas and the crack babies, and black women were labeled as unable to raise their children and not good mothers, and they were painted with a broad brush. It's interesting that now, as we see the opioid epidemic, those same terms and those same ideas haven't been repeated. Do you think that's because the media has learned from its previous mistakes?
I think it's because the opioid crisis is seen as a white problem. That it's seen as a health problem. The people aren't vilified. They have a health problem. I don't think the media has looked back on the crack era and said, oh, we made a mistake. I don't think that that's been done. No.
As the creator of the film, what do you hope people walk away with? What is the one thing, if there is one story that you'd hope people remember after watching this film?
Yeah, I don't mean to sound like this, but I don't think there's one story. I think that really the story is, how we got to where we are and what the little steps were that bring us up to the present, and I think it's never a bad thing to think about how we got here, especially now. What's happening in this country, how did we get here? Right. In the film, we talk about the war on drugs and the militarization of the police, and all of a sudden you see the police with tanks and automatic weapons and body armor, and all of that came from the war on drugs, which largely came from the war on crack.
Well, I'll tell you this: few stories are all-encompassing like this. I encourage everybody to watch it. I wish people would watch it in schools. I think once again, you've done an amazing job. Thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much.